And I've identified probably 100 memos that they probably wish they hadn't written, because it shows massive denials of due process. Most Americans would agree, at least until lately, that no matter how heinous the crime, no matter how disgusting the defendants, they get a fair trial. Then you hang them, but they get a fair trial. But they didn't want to give Nixon's people a fair trial. There were secret meetings between the prosecutors and the judges, and secret meetings between the prosecutors and the congressional staff in the House Judiciary Committee, and even some secret meetings between people on the Ervin Committee and Judge Sirica. And you're sitting, you picture a triangle. There's a branch at each point, executive, legislative, judicial. They were all secretly communicating with each other. And what makes it so different is they left a paper trail. And I got the paper trail.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Nick Solheim. I am the CEO of American Moment. And today on Moment of Truth, we will be taking a blast to the past. We're going to be talking about President Richard Nixon. We're going to talk about the beginnings of lawfare with the great Geoff Shepard, who served on the legal team defending President Nixon during Watergate. Nixon is sort of in vogue to be a fan of these days. I've been reading a biography about him. Lots of very exciting things happening on the Nixon front, and so we're excited to have Geoff Shepard on to talk about his time serving in the Nixon White House, his defense of President Nixon, and how what we saw during the Nixon administration in terms of lawfare in the deep state sort of foreshadowed what's been happening to President Trump over the last couple of years. Geoff, served in the Nixon White House. He emerged unscathed. He was not sent to prison, fortunately, after his service in the White House, but he ended up working in private practice for a number of years after that, and has recently written a fantastic book about Richard Nixon and the plot of the deep state against him. Which we'll talk a little bit about during this podcast episode. I highly recommend that you go and pick it up. Geoff is super entertaining. He also recently appeared on the Tucker Carlson podcast. I would recommend that you go listen to that. That was also a fascinating episode. We are very glad to have him, and so we will go now to Geoff Shepard. Geoff, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So you've got quite an interesting background, probably more of an interesting background than almost anyone we've ever had on this podcast. Tell us your life story and how we ended up here doing this podcast interview with this beautiful book behind you.
Sure. Well, my life story is very brief. There's this ancient Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. And I have lived in interesting times, I got to tell you. Watergate remains the greatest political scandal in American history. And I was right in the center of it from the beginning to the very end. I was a very young man. Let me tell you how I got to the White House. I had a perfectly normal upbringing for Southern California. I was born in Santa Barbara. I went to the Irvine Elementary School when there were 30 kids in the 8th grade. Irvine was 6 buildings. I went to Long Beach Wilson High School, public high school. And then to Whittier College. It's a Quaker school, a Quaker heritage school, and they're big on education and teaching. Even today, the Friends schools are very prominent. I did well. I was junior class president, and I was student body president, and I really enjoyed myself. But the unique thing that happened was that I won the Richard Nixon Scholarship. Now, Nixon had gone to Whittier College, graduated in 1934. When I was there, he had been vice president, but then lost to Jack Kennedy in 1960, dropped out of politics. But the Republican women of Whittier, the most famous graduate, had an annual scholarship. And the dean called me up and said, "You won the Nixon scholarship." And I said, "Well, I didn't even apply." He said, "Oh, well, the women give the award, but they let us pick the recipient. And we picked you. Here's what you do. You go to the lunch, okay? The ladies have a luncheon, and they'll give you the scholarship, and it's $250 cash, not a credit against your tuition, cash." Well, I was pleased.
Yeah.
So I go, and to everybody's astonishment, so did Dick Nixon. Now, he'd retired from politics. He'd gone to New York to practice law, but he'd arranged for Bob Hope to be the convocation speaker, and he came out to be polite to Bob Hope. And since he was there, he came to the luncheon. Well, he wasn't involved in politics. There was no press, but I sat next to him. And we talked about college, and we talked about I wanted to be a lawyer and this kind of stuff. And I left, with my head swollen and $250 richer, you know. And then 2 weeks later, the scholarship dean calls me again. He says, "You must have made a heck of an impression on the former vice president." I said, "What do you mean?" He said he went back to New York and doubled your scholarship. He sent us a separate personal check for $250,
Wow.
Come get it.
Yeah.
So I was really thrilled. So I go off to law school. I happen to have aced the LSATs at a time that Harvard Law School was eager to expand its geographic diversity. And they devoted some of the incoming class to kids from no-name schools. These are not Ivy League universities or anything, who aced the LSATs. So I got in. I'm actually an affirmative action admittee. So I go off to law school. And Nixon goes off and runs for president. So on election eve, 1968, I'm one of 4 or 5 Republicans at Harvard, and he wins. Now, how many presidents did you know at age 24? Okay, because I had lunch with him. So what I did was apply for a program to go to Washington to help. And in the alumni office, there was this folder on what are called White House fellowships. And they were started by Lyndon Johnson, 1965. And they would take about 15 young Americans in the beginning of their careers, bring them to Washington on a fellowship for a year to study the executive branch. So I competed. Highly competitive. The rumor was there were 1,000 applicants. And I'm tall and I'm articulate and I interview well. But nobody else had a personal scholarship from the newly elected president.
Right.
So I graduate from Harvard Law School in May of 1969. 2 weeks later, I'm selected to be a White House fellow. So it's my first job coming out of law school.
And did you do any, did you send the president a letter?
No.
It's just, they happen to recognize that you were.
Well, you make an application and you go through a long interview process with different groups. And somehow it always came up that I had this. Yeah, somehow came up that I had this scholarship. And then we got in that era, you went away for 3 days for the finals, and about 30 young people, and they were going to pick half. So you got a 50-50 chance. And they let you go home on Sunday, and they say, now, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning at the Civil Service Commission, we post the winners. So come on down. You can see the list, see if you won. And I wasn't going, I'm not going to go show up and congratulate all these older people, who'd really accomplished stuff. So I called in. And they said, well, let me go look. And they go, no. Oh, yeah, you did. You got selected. You're due at the White House at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Put on a suit. So we went over and we were introduced. And in Nixon's remarks, he says, these are the young Americans and all this promising program. And they're from Harvard and Yale and Whittier. So he knew whoever did the talking points.
Yeah.
Also made good use of that. So my fellowship year went by very quickly. I was enjoying myself. I was single. went to all the programs. We had meals or meetings with the great and the near great that run Washington. That's what the fellowship was all about. And then time came to leave, and I had befriended one of Nixon's top associates, John Ehrlichman, who was counsel to the president when we were selected as fellows. And I had just graduated from law school, so we chit-chatted at that first meeting about the law. So we also met with him at the end of the year, and in between the start of the year and the end of our year, he had become assistant to the president for domestic affairs. He was the most powerful domestic guy, the counterpart of Henry Kissinger.
And this was pre-Domestic Policy Council,
Yes,
right?
it was.
Okay.
But it was the Domestic Council was created on July 1st, 1970. So it's the last month of our fellowship year.
Mm.
Now John is assistant to the president for domestic affairs. We were having a fellowship luncheon, and he says to me as we walk into to the meeting, "What are you going to do now that your year's over? Are you going to practice law?" And you sit there, and this light goes off, and I said to myself, "You don't have the nerve to do this." And then I thought, if you don't, you'll never forgive yourself. So I said, "Well, what I'd really like to do is get a job on the White House staff, but I don't know how to apply." And he says, "Oh, that's easy. You come see me." And he had, since they just created the Domestic Council, it's the Domestic Policy Council today, but then it was the Domestic Council. He had about 40 fully funded paid slots to fill. So I was probably, he took his staff with him from the White House, but I was probably the first outside hire. Nobody else had budget numbers to hire anybody, but John did. So he hired me, and I stayed on the Nixon White House staff for 5 years. Now, there was turnover. We had some exits, and the new counsel to the president came in, and I would go down. I was pretty full of myself in that era. I mean,
you work in the White House.
Got to be humble, but
some things never change.
Some things never change. Let me tell you where I work. Hi, here's my gold medal. So I would drop by the new counsel to the president, who is Fred Bizart. When Al Haig came over to be chief of staff to replace Bob Haldeman, he brought with him the solicitor at the Department of Defense, a guy named Fred Bizart. And I would go down twice, I did it, and I asked him in a very nice way, how come we were doing such a junky job defending the president? We get losing ground every day. And these were not easy meetings. He did not want to see me. But after the tape system became public, he needed help with the tapes. So he invited me down to his office and said, "Look, we're going to have to turn these over someday. We're resisting it. We're going to fight it in court. But someday these tapes are going to get turned over to the prosecutors. We've got to know what's on those tapes." Now, Rose Woods, the president's private secretary, she's done the first cut, but she can't follow the conversation. You've got to listen to those, study those tapes, work on those tapes, because we can't afford to be surprised. And you'll pick up something quicker than somebody else. You've been here, you know the players, you know the issues. So I became the primary person, the verb that Fred Bizart used in interviewing Bob Woodward. He said Shepard would verify the transcripts. Rose did the first cut, then Shepard verified them. And I did all the tapes from beginning to end. And honest to Pete, it was like reading a novel. You didn't know. I mean, I had a transcript in front of you, Rose's transcript. You didn't know what they were going to say on the next page. It was fascinating. And then we published the transcripts in what's been called the Blue Book. Looks like a telephone directory of all these transcripts of, I think there are 48 Watergate-related transcripts. Now, and just to finish on that, so I peak early. It's absolute fluke. It's fluke to have gone to Whittier. It's fluke to have been selected a White House fellow, fluke to be invited onto John Ehrlichman's staff, and then it all turns to ashes. So I'm absolutely at the top. I mean, this is pretty heady stuff. And Ehrlichman's staff on the domestic council was the happiest staff in the White House. We were taught, encouraged to think outside the box, get the government out of the way of good ideas. You were supposed to be innovative. And Ehrlichman was a perfect boss. You got to sign your own memos. You try that with congressional staff. You do a good memo, the senator gets it. There's a mess up, you take the blame.
Yeah.
But our names accompanied our work. So we were, it was fun and fascinating. And then, as I say, it all turned to ashes. The proudest achievement in my young life, I'm 29 when Nixon resigned, and I was there throughout and all that stuff. Now I'm unemployable. You worked on the White House staff for Nixon. You must have done something wrong. I mean, in total for Watergate, Nixon not only resigns in disgrace, 24 members of his administration are convicted and imprisoned. My friends went off to jail. So early successes, I was unemployable. I mean, and to deal with that, I mean, I transcribed the tapes. I ran the document rooms holding the seized files for Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and John Dean. And the prosecutors wanted certain documents to introduce in court. And there's something, when you go to introduce evidence, you have to show how it got there. How did it get to court? And this is called chain of custody. How do we know this is his memo? And I was the one that took the memo as instructed, remove the memo from a file drawer 3, folder 4, and give it to the special prosecutor.
And by the way, these were the guys that gave you your job.
Absolutely. These were my heroes.
Man. Yeah.
And there are 2 major trials. There's the Plumbers trial for one of the break-ins, and there's the cover-up trial. The burglars, they got indicted, they got convicted, they should have. That's none of my involvement. I was a witness, a chain of custody witness for the Plumbers trial, and I was under subpoena to be a similar witness for the cover-up trial. And the reason that became important, and then I'll stop where I am. Toward the end of the Nixon administration, what caused it to blow up at the end, slowly at first, and then all of a sudden, the Supreme Court ruled in July 24th, 1974, the tapes had to be turned over to the prosecutors, not to the Congress. They'd ruled consistently that was separation of powers. But for criminal investigation purposes, the prosecutors got to go look. Okay? So the lawyers were then told of the 64 tapes that were under subpoena that Fred ought to go listen to one of them. June 23rd, 1972, right after the break-in. And on that tape, Haldeman comes in, says the FBI investigation is going in a direction we don't want it to go. And Nixon says, what do you mean? He says, well, they're tracing the money. Now, they had traced the money to the president's reelection committee, but they then wanted to see how it got to the reelection committee in the first place. And one of the ways it got there was several top secret donations from Democrats who were hedging their bets, gave money to Nixon's reelection under the absolute assurance it would never be disclosed. And the head fundraiser came in to John Dean, the president's lawyer, and said, they want to interview our fundraisers. And if they do that, these guys' names will become public. So John Dean thought about it, told Haldeman the way to head this off is to get the CIA to tell the FBI it's a CIA operation. Don't interview those people. Don't interview those 2 people. And Nixon says, well, who are they? And Haldeman names the middlemen, and Nixon doesn't know who they are. They're fundraisers, they're bundlers. So one of the great phrases on the White House tapes, he says, who is it? Well, it's Ken uh, Dognall, Ken Dahlberg. Ken Dahlberg. And Nixon says, who the hell is Ken Dahlberg? So had to be turned over to the prosecutors. Bizarre listened to the tape for the first time after the Supreme Court decision, concluded wrongly that it showed the president was in on the cover-up from day one, and announced this has to be disclosed. If the president doesn't resign rather than turn over the tapes, if the president's going to stay in office and fight this out, we got to turn this tape over. Called me down to his office and said, go transcribe this tape. Well, I was the third person to hear what is known today as the smoking gun tape. I'm the one who transcribed it. I'm the one who called it the smoking gun because my boss, the president's lawyer, was just appalled at what had been discovered.
Yeah.
So I'm all over this, on the staff, know everybody, heavily involved in the defense of Nixon, lose very, very badly. And the prosecutors started going after the president's lawyers. Today, you'll know, we're not just gonna fix these defendants, we're gonna fix the lawyers who defended them. And they started going after the people involved with the tapes. And I went down after everything's cleaned out and everybody's, they're indicted or they're going up to trial. And I went to see the special prosecutor and I said, I've been ruined. I functioned as a lawyer, a perfectly honorable defense, and now I'm unemployable. And he said, well, you're lucky you weren't indicted. You were awfully close and you ought to just be happy with that. And I said, no. I was an honorable lawyer doing what lawyers do. You know what I did. He said, well, what do you want? I said, I want a letter. I want a letter saying I've never even been a suspect. And he said, we don't do letters. I said, well, you do it for me. I'm innocent. In any event, I'm the only member of the senior White House staff who has a clearance letter.
Wow.
So I go, it's like walking through a forest fire. As a kid, I wasn't making the decisions throughout, but I was on the stage. I had a walk-on part and I got to see everything. So in any event, I lived through the whole thing. I survived. Start, finish. We left after Watergate. It was such a wipeout. We moved to Philadelphia. I started a 35-year career as a corporate lawyer. And it wasn't until about 15 years ago that I decided to go back and sift through the ashes because I didn't think we'd succeeded in putting our best foot forward. And in the course of that, and I had started to go on like this, but I discovered the internal records of the Special Prosecution Force were available for review if you put in a FOIA request. This is like discovering 30 years later that you have access to the coach's playbook from the team that beat you in the state finals. You know what you were trying to do. Now you can see what they were trying to do, who was sick, who was weak, how were they making their staffing decisions. And I started doing all this discovery. And what I discovered is the prosecutors were so eager to bring Nixon and his people down, they cheated. And you can appreciate that today. The hatred of Trump is such, it's only human for prosecutors to be tempted to reach a little further than due process would ordinarily allow. And they not only did it, they left a paper trail. And I've uncovered the paper trail. So the last 15 years, I have become probably the nation's foremost critic of the Watergate prosecution. So that's my story.
That is probably the most interesting introduction to the podcast we've ever had. I have a million follow-up questions, but I think the easiest place to start is, our audience skews a lot younger.
Sure.
A lot of them were not around during Watergate.
Yep.
Can you give the timeline series of events of what happened?
2.5 years. I'll do it very quickly. There's a break-in, June 17th, 1972. 5 people are arrested in the offices of the Democrat National Committee in the Watergate office building, caught red-handed. One turns out to be an employee of the committee to reelect the president's reelection committee, James McCord, and 4 are Cuban Americans, caught with recording devices, gloves, cameras, and are quickly indicted. Because they were caught red-handed, the prosecutors, we're talking the career prosecutors at this point, they didn't have to prove why they were there. They could just convict them for being there. And 2 others who were masterminding the break-in, a guy named Howard Hunt, who's a career CIA agent, 40 years, and a guy named Gordon Liddy, who worked for the FBI and then was an assistant district attorney in upstate New York. Gordon had been charged with drafting a campaign intelligence plan. Now, most of your listeners understand every campaign has an intelligence plan. It's designed to learn as much as you can about your opponent. Where's the money? What are the issues? Maybe there's dirt in their background. The trouble with Gordon Liddy is that he let a criminal mind run rampant, and he prepared a plan supposedly for $1 million that envisioned mugging, bugging, kidnapping, and prostitution. And you can say, oh, Geoff, you're just making all that up. Nobody would have done that. But Gordon was so proud of his plan when he wrote his autobiography, he describes it in glorious detail. Everything that I've said. I mean, and it was called Gemstone, and each precious gem was a different aspect, diamond and ruby and sapphire, different aspects of his plan.
And he was doing this in his, I guess, private capacity while not at work for the FBI?
No. He had joined the White House staff on my group, on the domestic council, before the plumbers break-in. Now, you remember there's this group of papers, another secret study called the Pentagon Papers.
Mm-hmm.
It is drafted by the 3 top anti-war professionals in the Department of Defense under Lyndon Johnson. It goes back and interviews, how did we get into the Vietnam War? How did it all go wrong? And one of the authors of that study started to leak it because he was opposed to the war.
It ultimately ended up being Mike Gravel that read them into the record, right? Think so? The senator from Alaska?
Yeah, but it's not Ravel. It's Michael something.
Okay.
It's been 50 years.
Yeah.
And then that gets published. I mean, it's a 4-volume set. I have it. The actual papers were totally declassified and posted by the National Archives on their website in 2011. But when it leaked, it was thought to be the greatest national security leak in 20 years. And they went after the main leaker, who was very proud of it, Daniel Ellsberg, and prosecuted him. But the worry from the White House point of view was that he had access to 54,000 other classified documents because of his work for the RAND Corporation, which was a defense think tank. So Rand wasn't being helpful. His first wife, he was divorced, his first wife said, well, he used to go see a shrink every week. Doesn't do it anymore, but he used to. So the thought was, well, why don't we go see if the shrink knows what his intent is with all these other documents? We didn't know he'd taken them. We just knew he had access. We is not me, Nixon staff. So they got the bright idea because his psychiatrist wouldn't cooperate. So they got the bright idea, let's break in and have a look for ourselves. into the shrink's files. And they get these Cubans, the veterans of the anti-Castro group in Florida, to go conduct a break-in. Now, it didn't go well. They didn't find any file, but they couldn't pick the lock, so they broke a window to get in. And this is Gordon Liddy instructing them, break a window, make it look like a drug bust, like they were after narcotics. And they weren't successful, but it assured there'd be a police report from this break-in. So go fast forward 2 years. These are the same guys who do the break-in into the Watergate office building. And that's blamable on the committee to reelect. But the plumbers group put together to stop leaks, those are White House employees. That leads directly into the West Wing. So you had a combination of ingredients going on in Watergate. The actual burglars are convicted in January of 73. But there's a cover-up. The question was, who knew about the break-in? And the problem for the reelection committee was a lot of people knew, because Gordon was around bragging about what they were doing and keeping a record. And they may have shredded the record, but these other people who knew what Gordon was up to but weren't involved were scared to death. So they started a cover-up to protect higher-ups. And it worked. It worked through the trial of the burglars, but when they set sentencing day, and that's when the pressure became too much. One of the masterminds folded, wrote a letter to Judge Sirica saying there's been a cover-up, and they launched a whole new investigation. And that's one of the examples of it's not the crime, it's the cover-up. Well, the cover-up went right to the top people. And they, the first guy to flip was the president's own lawyer, John Dean, who'd done it all. He'd hired Gordon Liddy. He'd been at the meetings where he knew it was planned. And he didn't know the timing, but he knew that the idea was to break in. And then he orchestrated the cover-up. The head of the FBI investigation said on tape and in oral history for the National Archives that he blamed John Dean for 95% of the cover-up. And you're sitting there, but he was the first to approach prosecutors, and he flipped, testified against more important people higher up than he was, and said, nicely, I'm the only one that can lead to these other people. You want them worse than you want me. So you've got to let me go to testify against Nixon's very top aides. They did that. They convicted his top aides in the cover-up trial. And while I didn't testify, I was under subpoena because I had transcribed the smoking gun tape. And they went off to 2.5 to 8 years in jail. Nixon's top, his attorney general, his chief of staff, my boss, John Ehrlichman. And their thing sat for 30 years. And then stuff starts to come out. And I learned the archives has all these documents. And I believe I'm one of just a handful of people who were sufficiently involved they could pick out the wrongdoing in these memos, because I went through the whole thing. And I've identified probably 100 memos that they probably wish they hadn't written, because it shows massive denials of due process. Now, most Americans would agree, at least until lately, that no matter how heinous the crime, no matter how disgusting the defendants, they get a fair trial. Then you hang them, but they get a fair trial. But they didn't want to give Nixon's people a fair trial. There were secret meetings between the prosecutors and the judges, and secret meetings between the prosecutors and the congressional staff and the House Judiciary Committee, and even some secret meetings between people on the Ervin Committee and Judge Sirica. And you're sitting, you picture a triangle. There's a branch at each point, executive, legislative, judicial. They were all secretly communicating with each other. And what makes it so different is they left a paper trail. And I got the paper trail.
Yeah. So let's talk about that paper trail. What sort of collusion specifically was going on between prosecutors, judges, the Hill staff that you're referencing? I believe you have some documents
let's start with this.
here.
I'll just hold this up for just a second. This is Watergate Secrets, Shepard's document. And my whole case is a document case. So what I did, and this happened to be put together for a presentation to the Hoover Institution a year or two ago, and it isolates 24 of what I think are the worst memos you could possibly imagine, and documenting secret meetings by and between the prosecutors and the judges, 3 judges, and the Congress. And I'm just going to show one because we're short of time, but this is a letter on special prosecution stationery dated December 27th. I'm reading it from memory, to Judge Sirica. And it says right in the first sentence, when Messrs. Ruth, Lacavara, Benvenisti, and I met with you and Judge Gazelle at your request on Friday, December 14th, and then it goes on, those are the 4 top Watergate prosecutors and the 2 judges who will conduct the trials of the Watergate people, the Plumbers trial and the cover-up trial. You don't have to have gone to Harvard Law School to realize the prosecutors are not allowed to meet secretly with the judges. But here's written proof that's what they did. Then Judge Sirica, who is chief judge of the district court in D.C., he's going to have to give up his position as chief judge when he turns 70, and then he won't be able to appoint himself to preside over the trial, which he very much wants to do. He's already presided over the burglars trial. Now he wants the cover-up trial because he's on a tear. So they work out a way that he can appoint himself. They have to bring the indictment before March 19th when he'll turn 70. And then they have to ask for special handling because it's like today, cases are assigned by rotation. But if the prosecutors then say, well, this is special handling, this is a more important case, then the chief judge can appoint whomever he chooses, and he chose himself. So it's a conspiracy to get your own judge and a conspiracy to get evidence gathered by the grand jury to the Congress, which doesn't have a grand jury. And that's all documented in these papers. And in one of them, this is document number 7, but here's document number 9. This is the meeting with Jaworski and Sirica where they work out how he's going to enable Sirica to name himself. I mean, it's kind of a quid pro quo. I want to send this evidence up to the Hill, which it's not proper. Grand jury evidence is secret forever. You want to be named to preside over the case. We can work this out together. And it's right there, as they say, in black and white.
Yeah. That is incredible.
So I run around with my documents. About this time, your listeners may tune out, but people's eyes start to glaze over because this isn't, he shot him and we got a movie on the gun. This takes work. You've got to get into those documents and understand what was at stake. And most people don't find that worth their time.
Yeah.
So I think I'm a talented researcher. I mean, I've uncovered really dynamite stuff and a poor salesman because I have been unable to convince people in power that this is worth another look. Even 50 years later, the cheating was so massive, it's worth another look. Now, I tried with the previous Department of Justice under the previous president, and they wanted nothing to do with this. They refused to even look into it. But there's great hope. I live on hope. There's great hope that the new administration with the Department of Justice will look. All I want is an opportunity to come explain what I've uncovered. I think when they understand what happened, even 50 years later, they'll say, we can't stand behind these verdicts. This is massive denial of due process guaranteed by our Bill of Rights.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. I want to do a bit of an explanation about how this kind of ended up snowballing into, President Nixon resigning. And
Sure.
I think a large part of that, was the media narrative surrounding this, largely driven by Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein. How did this snowball into, beyond some of these prosecutions that happened later, into Nixon resigning?
Well, it was a series of unfortunate events that
As it seems this whole story is.
became public. At the time, there was only one viewpoint, one media viewpoint, and it was anti-Nixon. Nixon was a classic outsider. He was distrusted by everybody, even the Republican establishment. In that era, we're talking 50, 60 years ago, Californians were considered strange. It wasn't the left coast. They were different. And Nixon was raised as a Quaker. The Quakers were considered different. And he didn't really have charisma. And if you were to contrast Nixon with Trump, one of the tremendous differences is Nixon he was solid, he worked hard, he was straight as an arrow, but not charismatic. The difficulty was they trusted their lawyer, John Dean, because when the burglars were caught, Dean assured the White House nobody on the White House staff knew anything about this. So they were innocent as the driven snow. But Dean knew about it, and the people at the reelection committee knew about it. And one by one, they started getting picked off because you start to worry about your own future. So the White House would keep saying, we're okay. But the news media was just all over them. Now, in that era, there were only three networks, NBC, ABC, CBS. There were two national news magazines, weeklies, Time and Newsweek, and there was one predominant newspaper, the New York Times. And they ballyhooed all the bad news. We couldn't get our side of the story out. And then Woodward and Bernstein had this secret source. Now, at the time, it wasn't called Deep Throat. It was just a secret source, and they wouldn't disclose who it was. It was only Bob Woodward. In the book they wrote 2 years later, they said, oh, we called the source Deep Throat, but we can't tell you who it was because of journalistic ethics. Well, 30 years later, 30 years, it turns out Deep Throat is a disgruntled deputy director of the FBI, not on Nixon's staff at all, who really liked Nixon. But he wanted to be named head of the FBI to replace J. Edgar Hoover. And to do so, he had to knock off the acting director, a rather bumbling person named Pat Gray. So Deep Throat is his top deputy at the FBI, feeding him incorrect information, knifing him in the back, and it's all coming out in the newspaper. And we don't know where it's coming from or why. But the great disservice that Bob Woodward did is he knew who Deep Throat was, and for 30 years, he actively promoted the idea it was a member of Nixon's White House staff. So disgusted with the criminality throughout the staff that he was leaking it to the special prosecutors. Woodward didn't have to disclose Felt's identity. That's his choice. But to even encourage, if you go back and look at the movie, All the President's Men, there's 3 separate instances in that movie where they make it abundantly clear Deep Throat works on Nixon's staff. And that's an unforgivable misrepresentation to the American public. Another thing that happened, again, Bob Woodward's problem, after Leon Jaworski, who was the second special prosecutor, after he retired, went back to Texas, his first interview was with Bob Woodward. And he talks to Woodward, and he says in the opening segment, I happen to have that right here, from Bob's notes, Bob Woodward's typed notes, which are now at the University of Texas in Austin. The second sentence on the first page, quoting Jaworski, says there were a lot of one-on-one conversations that nobody knew about but him and the other party. Now, you sit there and Jaworski's volunteering this, and you ask yourself today, who could he have been referring to? Who could this secret communication have been with? Everything Jaworski was doing was public, except his private meetings with Judge Sirica. And it's abundantly clear to me, I'm no fan of Woodward's, that Jaworski was begging to be asked about those meetings. And this is December 5th, 1974. We wouldn't have had to wait 30 years to learn what Bob Woodward did. And then in the second paragraph, we don't have to go into it too deeply, but he says, we staffed the House Judiciary Committees, our prosecutors who gave them all the evidence. So and again, Woodward never followed up on it. Just nothing short of incredible.
Yeah.
A violation of journalistic ethics. The greatest investigative reporter of all time messes up incredibly, because if he had followed up, it would have ruined the narrative.
Yeah. And this is the thing that made his career, right?
He's gone back to it, always back to, I think there are 5 books.
Yeah.
All the President's Men, The Final Days, Impact on Watergate, Impact on Presidents Later. And same thing with John Dean. John Dean keeps, it's the gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah.
And you sit there, and as I say, I've uncovered all this stuff which shreds both of their reputations. News media won't cover it. They won't touch it.
So if my memory serves, it came as a surprise to many, including some people in the administration, that Nixon ended up resigning.
Yes.
Can you walk us through, in your view, his sort of decision tree on how he ended up making that call to resign?
Stubborn man, convinced he did no wrong. But Nixon gave up the presidency in 1960 when he felt he was cheated by Jack Kennedy, and lots of people wanted him to challenge the election. And he said, no, America cannot withstand doubt as to who their president is at the height of the Cold War. So he walked away from challenges. I'm not saying he would have won, but lots of people think he would have won. Go fast forward to 1974. The party is in smithereens. The press is hounding him unmercifully. All of his people are convicted, sent off to jail. And the 3 top Republican leaders in the Congress, Barry Goldwater, Mr. Conservative, Johnny Rhodes, the minority Speaker of the House, and Hugh, who has a last name, the senator from Pennsylvania, come to call on him and say, Mr. President, if you don't resign, it's going to be a bloodbath at the midterms, and the midterms are just a couple of months away. So Nixon didn't resign because he thought he was guilty. He resigned because he felt he was saving his party. You can argue over it. You can say, well, he should have fought it out. Given what I've uncovered, yes, he should have fought it out. This stuff might have come to light a lot sooner. Now, back to my case. My case is the prosecutors, the judges, and the Hill staff cheated, met secretly, exchanged points of view, unforgivable. It doesn't mean everybody was innocent. The issue in a national political scandal is not, are you innocent? It's, are you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? These people didn't get a fair trial. I don't know what the outcome might have been if they had gotten a fair trial. I'm not going that far. But I think it's a very, very close question because they secretly protected John Dean.
Yeah.
John Dean was heavily involved in the cover-up, and they let him go in exchange for his testimony. And Dean's testimony isn't part of the recording, because if Nixon wasn't in the room, the White House tapes don't run. So his testimony against John Ehrlichman and Bob Haldeman is based on his word against theirs. But they'd been ruined because of the publicity.
Right.
So I don't think they got close to a fair trial.
Did any of them, after getting out of prison, go on to do anything, or was it like their careers were over?
What did you have in mind?
Well, I mean, you went on to go do,
I did
corporate.
something totally separate.
Yeah.
Okay. Bob Haldeman wrote 2 books. One is his diary, published posthumously. Ehrlichman wrote several books about Watergate and a novel or 2. They never were involved in public affairs again. John Mitchell is the one principal character of Watergate who never wrote a book, but James Rosen, who's a very prominent reporter, he did a biography of John Mitchell called The Strong Man, which makes up for that. We know each other quite well. We have differences of opinion on key aspects of Watergate. He believes the White House set up Mitchell as things came apart. And I believe Dean set up his superiors at the White House. It's nobody comes out a hero, except the career prosecutor in the first instance, Earl Silbert. He's principal assistant U.S. attorney, plays it right down the middle, breaks the cover. And so the Congress imposes a special prosecution team, and the first thing they do is fire the career prosecutors and not let them be involved. They've broken the case. But the specially recruited special prosecutors held the case open for 10 months to continue to leak stories and ruin the Republican Party.
Yeah, so we were talking before we started recording about this roadmap that was, pivotal in naming the president as a co-conspirator. Can we talk about that? Like, tell us about the roadmap.
The prosecutors were appointed, the special prosecutors. There were almost 100 of them from the beginning. That was their table of organization and employment. 100 specially recruited people who hated Nixon. The top 17 of whom had worked in the Kennedy-Johnson Department of Justice. This is a constitutional inversion where the people who lost power with Nixon's election are suddenly in charge of prosecuting Nixon and his people. So you've got a completely biased prosecution. They're supposed to use the grand jury, which that's prosecutors' tool, to gather evidence to prosecute. But they decide, again in a secret meeting with Judge Sirica, that the law is too unclear as to whether a sitting president can be indicted. It's unclear today. There's been no case. We think it's not doable, but never been held. So their dilemma is they got all this evidence, but they've decided it's a clearer path to impeach Nixon than to indict him. And their dilemma is, how do we get all this evidence that we've gathered using the grand jury up to the House Judiciary Committee, which doesn't have access to a grand jury, and the grand jury information is secret forever. That's current federal law, was federal law back then. So what they do, one of their top hotshots says, well, that may be, but let's call it a presentment instead of a report. And we can go see Sirica. Let's go meet with him secretly. Let's go fix him so that he rules in our favor on getting this stuff sent up there. Let me see if I can find the... it's going to take me too long to find the actual document. There's a memo I've uncovered where the counsel to the special prosecutor says, let's go see Sirica and convince him if we call it a presentment, he can forward it to the Hill, still under seal. So Nixon's people can't even see what we're accusing him of doing. And they draft a report, and the report is nicknamed the Roadmap because it is said to lead to Nixon's certain impeachment. And everybody ballyhoos the roadmap this, the roadmap that, but nobody gets to see it because it's secret grand jury information. So Nixon's defenders don't know what he's been accused of. Now, I finally got that unsealed in 2018. 2018
It's a little
is
late.
a little late. And right there at the top, it's posted now on the National Archives website. It says unsealed by order of the district court, October 11th, 2018. And then of course, I know a little bit about this stuff and I go through it, and they cheated. They cheated in what they represented to the House Judiciary Committee. Nobody could pick it out because they weren't knowledgeable enough about the case. And just, I don't want to take too much longer, but one of the fun things, and it's explored in my book. I mean, that's what we hope. The issue is what was said on March 21st, 1973. John Dean comes in and says there's a cancer in the presidency. It's growing. It's mutating. We're in real trouble. People have perjured themselves. And now we have a demand for money by one of the lead witnesses. And we see it as blackmail. He said he's going to bring us down if we don't pay him the money. And they spend an hour and a half debating what to do. Now, we have the tape. So there are no words to argue over. It's open and shut. Nixon never directed the payment of that money. They discussed it. There's no question about that. They toyed with it. But even John Dean doesn't say Nixon approved it. But what makes it spicy is that very night at 10 o'clock, a payment was made to Howard Hunt's lawyer. So from the prosecutor's point of view, he learned about the monetary demand, and it was paid 10 hours later. Perfectly clear to us, he must have authorized it. And it turns out in this chain of events, what's critical is when did Mitchell approve that payment? Mitchell admits he approved the payment. He only paid the legal fees, but he approved it. And the guy who he approved it with, a gentleman named Fred LaRue, was the paymaster. He delivered the money. But they can't ascertain the time of day. Now, here's the neat part. If LaRue talked to Mitchell in the morning of Wednesday, March 21st, before John Dean went over to see the president, then Nixon can't be in the chain of events. If LaRue talked to Mitchell in the afternoon, you have a stronger circumstantial case. Nixon must have approved it. But the morning does away with it, open and shut. They represent in the roadmap and in a memo that follows, it was approved in the morning. I'm sorry, that it was approved in the afternoon, that the call took place in the afternoon, and they say it's uncontested. There's no question. Nixon resigns. The cover-up trial occurs. 2 months later, LaRue's on the stand. When did Mitchell approve the payment? Not sure, but to the best of my recollection, it was in the morning. Prosecutors knew they couldn't prove the call occurred in the afternoon, so they misrepresented the Congress.
Yeah.
Now, you can't pick that out unless you're so far off in the weeds, let's go get 3 more drinks.
Yeah.
But it's open and shut if you understand that they cheated in their representations to the House Judiciary Committee.
Yeah.
Nixon wouldn't have had to resign if the truth were known because he didn't approve the payment.
Right. So what happens to, I actually don't know a lot about this. What happens to Nixon after he resigns?
Well, he goes home. He's sick, demoralized. He has phlebitis, which is a bad circulation in his legs. The doctors say he's too sick to fly to testify at the cover-up trial. Jerry Ford, who took his place, becomes convinced, I think reasonably, that Nixon's going to die. That unless he pardons him, he's just going to die. So he pardons him a month after he resigns. Okay, announces his resignation August 8th. He's pardoned on September 8th. From then on, if Nixon pokes his head up over the foxhole, the opponents are going to blow it off. Just, they hate him so much. They've got him cold. And the prosecutors write books about how great what they did and how great it was. And Sirica writes a book. They don't mention their secret meetings. Those come out starting in 2013 is when I first started to uncover these sensitive memos. But you're pushing a huge boulder up the hill. Nobody wants to spend the time to fully appreciate what was done. I mean, it's too long ago. So sometimes I compare myself to Don Quixote. I mean, Hilton at Windmills. I can write essays saying, no, you misinterpret. You didn't understand. Let me tell you what really happened. Nobody reads them. I mean, it's just not a popular topic. Now, we're making headway. We have a new management at the Department of Justice. We have a new president who thinks he's been wrong. And we got 4 new phrases that capture the public imagination: deep state, fake news, false narrative, and lawfare.
Yeah.
The misuse of the criminal law to get your political opponents. I'm screaming from the rooftops. That didn't start with Trump.
Yeah.
This all started back with Dick Nixon. I hope the Department of Justice will take a look at all this. I hope I will get the opportunity to go down and make my case in person, and I think it'll change everything.
Yeah. So what is the big takeaway from all of this for all of our listeners who, may not have spent that much time researching Nixon? How should we re-examine his legacy, this case, and what are you ultimately driving toward? Like, what is your goal here?
Sure. Lawyers are famous, take credit for the but-for argument. But for Watergate, Nixon would have gone down as one of our greatest presidents. Huge foreign affairs victories, opening to China, détente with the Soviet Union, ending the Vietnam War, reasserting American influence in the Middle East. Hugely differential, impacting president. And his domestic affairs, and I worked on the domestic affairs, are every bit as impressive. Restoring the treaty rights of Native Americans, peacefully integrating the Southern schools, enacting the 18-year-old vote, ending the draft, quadrupling the number of women in senior executive positions in the federal government. It's almost, the nation's tearing itself apart in '68 when he got elected because of the Vietnam War. And it's almost as Nixon, when he gets elected, close election, gets elected, looks around across the nation and says, who's got a legitimate beef? Who really has something where they can say, we're not being treated fairly? Women, kids sent off to war when they can't vote, Indians whose treaty rights are abrogated, segregated schools, lack of the Title IX for women's sports, just event after event after event, huge home runs. But they don't want to give Nixon credit for that because Nixon is the left's favorite whipping boy. He quit, therefore he must be guilty.
Yeah.
And to some extent you can't blame them. But even Republicans have made their peace with Nixon being a crook. Ted Cruz was on the air that just the other night, yeah, Nixon's a crook. It's so easy because you've never heard the other point of view.
Yeah.
If your listeners want to get into it, got a book, I have a website, www.shepardonwatergate.com. And the reason that's important, most authors, when they have a website, it's to sell their books. That's not mine. Mine is to produce the evidence. There are links to the documents I talk about in all 3 of my books. There's a comprehensive Watergate chronology that lays everything in order and how it came apart and how it got undone. So I'm eager for further scrutiny. People on the other side don't want anything to do with that because the facts are against them.
Yeah. You were telling me before we started recording about these lunches that you do
Yeah,
with former Nixon policy staff, and you said that started doing some sort of documentaries with people that
sure,
attend these lunches. Can you
sure.
tell us a little bit
Yeah.
about that?
What do you do other than Watergate? Well, I was the youngest lawyer on Nixon's staff. It blew apart. No library. People ran for cover. And after a couple of years, I missed my friends. It was my first job. I thought we did wonderful things. So I started arranging and hosting luncheons of the policy planning staff from Nixon's White House. This would be the National Security Council, the Domestic Council, and the Office of Management and Budget. And we would get together for a lunch once a year, right after the November election. Because this wasn't the campaigners. These are the people who actually ran the government. Now, your listeners may be aware, people who do campaigns, really expert, innovative, they often are not the people best to govern because campaigning is stark differences, accusatory, pureness to to enliven the base. Governance is the art of compromise. And you got to give some to make progress. So I would invite those three groups, and then we would include others who were policy impacting speechwriters. President's going to give a speech, got to have something to say. Policy is an outcome. Congressional lobbyists from the White House. There's a bill moving through Congress. We either like it or we're opposed to it, but you can't beat something with nothing. You better come up with something. So in the beginning, there would be about 80 people who were on the Nixon White House staff. And about 50 would show up each year. We still do them. People are passing away, so it's down 25, 30 people who are left. We had one last November. We've already got the date for next November. And then in 2010, I started producing documentaries about Nixon's public policy initiatives. I would take some of these same people I've been buying lunch for and co-sponsor with the National Archives, get them on the stage to talk about some issue, welfare reform, desegregating the southern schools, the opening to China. And they talk about how this came apart. It's usually an hour and a half at National Archives. And the archivist loves us because he says, you make my documents come alive. No other administration is doing this, but we have done 40 Nixon legacy forums. You can go on the foundation website and see them by topic, drug abuse or telecommunications, all kinds of nominations, personnel, very fascinating stuff of how it was done and why under one of our most creative presidents.
Yeah, that's very, very fascinating. I'm definitely going to be checking some of those out. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I want to give you an opportunity to one more time plug your website again and tell us about where
Sure,
people can find your work.
sure. If you go to law school, don't recommend that to anybody, but the prominent professors, they all have their own casebook. And the casebook is always their name on the topic. Chadbourne on evidence, Kasner and Leach on real property, Louis Loss on sec reg. So my website is www.Shepard on Watergate. And I put down everything you'd ever want to know about the Watergate scandal, particularly my complaints about how the prosecutors cheated. Now,
Yeah.
the judges cheated with them, and the Hill staff was down there doing the same thing. Secret meetings, secret transfer of information, entirely unblessed by the law.
Yeah. Well, this was a fascinating episode. Thank you so much for making the time and coming on.
Well, thank you for having me.
thank you for tuning in to another episode of Moment of Truth. Once again, that was Geoff Shepard from the Nixon White House telling us about the deep state and lawfare and all the crazy things that were going on in the 60s and 70s. I would highly recommend that you go buy a copy of his book, help support the work that he does. We wish him the best of luck as he tries to bring a lot of this lawfare to light. As always, please rate and review the podcast. 5 stars only, please. Help us to promote this show, get cooler guests, help us make a little bit of money or recover a little bit of the money that we spend putting this podcast together. I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you would like us to have more guests like that on, please don't hesitate to let us know. You can always tweet at me or X at me or whatever. But thank you for joining this episode of Moment of Truth, and we will see you again next week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier and Hunter Smith, with original graphics and title cards by Jared Cummings. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is AmericanMoment.org.